So I'm going to record this today, but again, you're free to ask questions. I'm also going to try on YouTube to kind of, as I make transitions between each topic, kind of give like a little identifier mark, so you can kind of scrub through quick and find shadows if you're not interested in the lens flare and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to jump straight into the lens flare, which if you don't know what a lens flare is, it's essentially the glare that you get through on a lens when you're taking a photo or a video, when your lens is pointed at a very bright object. And so you often will get these like little light blobs that kind of float along throughout your image. And something that I thought was kind of interesting that I've learned a long time ago is that the more light circles, I don't exactly know what to call them, the more that you have, the higher quality your lens is. So this may be, this actually is animated, but let's see. So here we might have like an iPhone lens where we have like 6 little circles for our lens flare. But as we like kind of scroll down, we can start to see lens flares where you have maybe more of a professional lens. And so I always like to kind of look at the lens flares in movies or TV shows and kind of count how many flares that I see. So another reason that I have this up is because I want to just like show you that what we're creating in Photoshop is exactly what you see in these images. And so you don't have to use Photoshop to create a lens flare. You can always find a lens flare that you like and download it and use the same tools to apply it to your rendering. So we're going to kind of move kind of along some of my past work to the Photoshop project that we'll apply our lens flare to. But I just wanted to show these couple of renderings because I think they do a great job at just like showing you the potential of like I know some of you are doing some nightlife renderings and kind of the potential that messing with a lot of the layer adjustments can do for unique and kind of unique and kind of forceful lighting. So like almost none of these images, source images, were shot in the dark except for like the submarine. And so I was able to use Photoshop to really force this like dark, deep ocean color and lighting to this rendering. Again, this one's a little dark, but I've been exploring this idea of having some cryptids that you can barely see in the dark. The original source image here might do some burying, and this is one of the reasons I highly recommend naming your layers because I'm just as new to these layers as you are. I have no idea what's happening here, but all of these pictures were in the daylight, and I was able to force some sort of night effects through Photoshop onto these source images. And so that's something that you can start to do now as you kind of are bringing your or landing your project. So in this project here, I'm going to close these just so my computer starts to run a little bit faster. Okay. So this is the project here that we're going to apply a lens flare to, and then also talk about adding some more light and sunlight and things like that. So the lens flare tool is, I think, an old something that's really ancient in Photoshop, and I can show you where it is, and it's actually a destructive form of editing. And so I'll show you kind of the quick way to do it, but then how to kind of start to do this more non-destructive form of using it. Okay, so the lens flare needs an image to apply the lens flare to. And so you need to select your backdrop image or your sky like I have here. And you want to go to Filter, Render, and Lens Flare. So what Photoshop will do is and you know, maybe I should just go back for a second. Photoshop does have a few kind of rendering options here. You can start to try to render trees. They look awfully computerized, or clouds. Those can help sometimes. And so I recommend playing around with that. But we'll go to that lens flare. And you can kind of pick on the image where your lens flare is going to be located. Along with that, and this is kind of going with what I had talked about with different lenses having different amounts of like circles going through them, is you can pick like what kind of lens you might be getting your lens flare through. I think this 50 to 300 millimeter, which is like, I think a zoom lens or a partial zoom lens, is kind of giving us the most like aesthetic lens flare, so we can go with that. And we can also adjust the brightness of our lens flare. So I kind of like that, and I'll press OK. But what this does is it permanently adds that lens flare to our source image. And so this is a destructive form of editing, because we cannot remove this flare. So some folks have kind of found a cool kind of workaround to make this a non-destructive form of editing. And that is by doing the steps that we just did. You apply that lens flare directly to your source image. And then you press Control Z. Actually, one second. Control Z. Oh. Start again. So I guess there's two different routes to go, and let's just start with the simplest route, which is we're going to create a new layer. Then we'll go to Layer, Layer Fill, or New Layer Fill. We'll have a solid color. And we click OK. And then this will allow us to pick the color. We want true black. Press OK. So now we have our solid color fill. We're going to have that go away for now. So we have that in our back pockets. And then we're going to find that background source image again. We're going to filter, render, create our lens flare. Maybe actually I want my sun to be a little bit in the clouds down there. I'll press OK. So now that's destructively added my lens flare to my source image. I will press Control Z, which removes that lens flare. But what it'll do is it will save the settings for that lens flare. So if I go to filter and just go to those assigned settings, it will place that lens flare where I had placed it originally, but on our filled layer, because I just opened up that filled layer. And what we can do from there is we have our black with the lens flare. Knowing that we can kind of change opacities of things, we can go down to screen, which, wow, that's really, move that around. When we press screen though, that removes the black of the image, and that lens flare is still there. So what I like to do is I always like to add just a little bit of a blur to almost everything I do. So I just think it'll help soften things a little bit. And then if I really want to, I can Control J to duplicate that and make it just a little bit brighter so it can pop out and maybe lower the opacity a little. So that's kind of bright, and I can adjust as needed. We could even, because we're working with masks, use that brush tool and start to like edit our flare as we want. But if you want kind of that like sun look without the whole flare, there's another quick way to do that, which I can show you. So that's how you do the lens flare. And some folks, I think, like in reviews, might really think that it's a cool way to kind of like make it look like a real photo. And I think other folks will actually really not like it. So I think it's going to be something that's a little, yeah, kind of create sides. Okay, so now we'll create, I know a lot of you are doing some like hot Canary Island sort of renderings, and you might want to have like a bright sun. For the sake of this, I might do a bright sun and kind of start to add some sunset colors to try to imply a sunset. We'll see how good I can do that. I haven't ran through this yet. So what I'll do first is I'm going to press G. G opens up the gradient tool. And because we're trying to make like a sun, we want that radial gradient, which can be found in our gradient toolbar up there. And we can just click and drag on our image and create sort of a radial gradient. This little knob here can kind of extend kind of the width of your gradient, which I think this is a, and if you want to change the color, you can double click in your circles. Suns aren't actually yellow, but a yellow bright spot implies a sun. So I think it's always important to like remember those things. Okay, so yeah, you can adjust the size, adjust the location, all within here. And yeah, so if I double click in this gradient fill layer here, there's a few more settings. This doesn't as important the angle when we're working in with the radial style. But what might be nice is opening up our gradient editor, and we can also kind of change the color. So like let's see if this will work. Okay. So let's say you make your radial gradient and it's like really, and we'll click OK. It's like really not what you wanted. We can go double click in our gradient layer fill, click on this gradient bar here. We can double click that. So these bottom boxes are color, and then these top boxes are opacity. And then because this is radial, we have our center is to the left and our outside is to the right. We can adjust these, and you can see how you can kind of play around with things. And now we've completely lost that color, which, let's see, how do we can now start to edit with. So really what we want is we want our center to be the most solid color and our outside to be faded. And so we'll turn down that opacity all the way so we have that nice bright spot. We'll click OK. And what we'll do is we'll just add, keep it normal, Control J, add a little bit of a screen. That screen just helps brighten up the sun a little bit. And I might even, if I was kind of really trying to get this to be perfect, add another like circle shape of bright yellow so we have more of that like center sun. And so there's multiple ways to create sunlight. One possible way, if you really want to get like that sun beating down onto your rendering, is by again pressing G, which creates a gradient layer. And because we had already made our sun, we can see up here that our gradient is what we want it to be. It's like this kind of bright sunny color. And we'll click and drag and create sort of a a linear gradient, which again, we have freedom to adjust as needed. And I'll have that coming from the sun, kind of beating down onto my subject. And I think a trick here that has a lot of uses in the future is if we right click on our layer, we can go to our blending options. So I think I've talked a little bit about this, but here in our opacity and like opacity blending area, we can adjust how much of our layer that we see. And so the current blend if is our current layer. Essentially, it's being assigned kind of a gray scale, and we can kind of control how much of that gray scale we let in. So if we had more than one color here, we could kind of adjust this current layer option here and start to remove like some of the lightness or darkness of our overlaying layer. Because this is all one color, once we hit that like assigned gray layer for Photoshop, our entire like layer will disappear. But because we kind of want this to like beat down on the spots that are bright in our rendering, we want the blend if underlying layer, which here you can see that right if we adjust this right side, the like lighter our and I might bring this up in just a second, but the lightest parts of our image no longer have our overlaying layer. If we do the inverse, our darkest parts of our image no longer have that layer. And so because the sun creates contrast, we want those like parts in the shade to be a little bit darker. And sometimes this can create a really like tough, you can kind of see it here, like a tough contrast between the shade and not shade. If you press Alt and click and drag on those tabs, you can kind of like spread out that gradient and the harshness of that transition, which is a really great way of starting to soften that lightness. Sorry, my Murphy's a little barking this morning or this afternoon. Okay, so once we have that, we can maybe apply a bit of a screen and lower the opacity just a little bit. And again, what that screen does is it applies that brightness and avoids like the darkness. And you can kind of see how it can start to add a little bit of brightness to a rendering. So that's one way of adding brightness to a rendering. Now I want to show you, I think, the way that I often will go about it, which sorry about that. So that can probably be best seen here. Where I went ahead and so this is our this was like a Rhino rendering that I had made, and it was in the Rhino world, so it didn't have the harsh lighting that background image had. And so what I did was I used a screen layer to essentially take out all the darkest parts of that image and only leave the brightest, which then were brightened the layer that it was over. And then I went ahead, and it still felt kind of weird to me. And so I added another brightness layer. And so what I recommend is exploring that screening tool to help apply brightness and like sunlight to things. And then I hate to say it, but then going in with a brush and kind of brushing away the parts that might need to be shaded. So this could be a little bit time consuming, but it really goes a long way when trying to apply some sunlight to an object. But I think this is a great place to kind of transition for a second into a really important lesson, I think, in kind of landing the plane and creating these renderings. So just wanted to show you, I guess, like kind of the evolution where I learned this really important lesson. So on the left is like when I first like decided I wanted to explore photography, it's like one of the first photos I had taken and then edited. So you can see that I had discovered the saturation tool and really had some fun with it. Those purples were not there, and these colors are so intense. But then throughout the years, that was in high school. Throughout the years, I've learned that you want to try to keep things as subtle as possible and apply the least amount of edits as you possibly can. And so you can kind of imagine how the image on the right could have looked if I applied some of those editing settings that I did on the left to the right. And all to say, I think it's always really important to remember that less is more. The less edits you can do to something, the better. It's the more simple for you, and it also creates, it's also often more simple for the viewer, and it creates less headaches when trying to figure out what looks the best. So this is something that can be applied to color palettes, fonts, really anything in graphic design. And so keeping that in mind, I just want to like kind of look at some of my other renderings and just noticing that I often, I think, avoid harsh shadows and harsh sunlight, which some folks may not like Clark, and that's totally valid. But it often can help kind of avoid like over editing and kind of getting stuck with like, okay, I have this really long dark shadow. Now I need to add that to everything I add in my Photoshop rendering. That's super complex and adds a lot of layers. But even when you have the most bright sort of subjects, you can kind of ignore, not ignore, but be really subtle in the lighting effects that you add. And that could be by just always having the least amount of contrast as possible in your images. And that kind of ties in to kind of landing the plane, so to speak. But before we kind of talk about like the finishing touches and kind of how I go about doing the less is more technique, are there any questions about like lighting or shadows?
Not a question, but this was really helpful. Thank you.
Yeah. And so something, just for like the sake of us all talking, like something that I'll do often is just create one of those layer adjustments, increase that exposure till it's looking kind of awful. And then I'll lower that opacity. And if we right click, so right now that exposure is added to literally everything on our rendering. If I right click that exposure white box there, I can see. Okay. Let's see, I can't find it right now, but I can show you kind of a
Are
unfortunate
you
workaround.
are you
Yeah.
trying to attach it to the layer directly underneath it?
No, I was hoping to make my mask black,
Oh,
which I thought in the past I would right click here and have inverse mask, but I'm not seeing it right now. But this
been
happens to
able
me
to find that
sometimes.
tool. I thought it was in there too, but I haven't seen it.
Yeah, so this happens to me sometimes. It's an unfortunate workaround is I open up my brush, make sure that my opacity is all the way up, and I'll just, draw black all over the image. And then see, there we go. When I right click, I can quick get into the size adjustments, and I'll make the size fairly small, increase that hardiness or decrease that hardiness as much as possible. And I'll and then press X so that we are now revealing that bright layer. And I'll sometimes go in and no, sorry, we should lower this opacity just a little bit more. And I'll just add some brightness to the things that I know would be bright if there was sunlight kind of like directly on it. So I'm doing this kind of crudely, but you can start to see how it works. And then, like the more we kind of lower that opacity, some of those inconsistencies that you just saw kind of start to disappear. And that's another like just quick way of adding some quick sunlight to an object. But again, as we look at these next renderings as sort of like what a couple last touches to a rendering may look like, kind of like look at how I treat sunlight and how I kind of avoid having to like edit in a bunch of shadows in lighting. And again, if there's any questions, just feel free to speak up. So we kind of looked at this one, but I can't, and let's just open this up and go to color lookup. This here applies has a bunch of different filters that we can apply to our rendering. And some are like really intense. And I was actually going to do a sunset experiment, but I was going to use a filter like sort of like this. They're really intense, and I usually will just try to find one that's a little bit more subtle and has just like a nice impact on the colors that I'm looking for. And then I'll just like lower that just a little bit. And what that kind of does is it helps kind of tie up all the random like kind of loose colors you have and lighting that you have going on, and kind of helps like flatten the image just a little bit. But as we go further, so here, see, it's really subtle, but I kind of just like stack up these little, stack up the color changes. And I also think it's good. Let's see. Let's go to the next one. Again, this is why I really try to show you best practices, because things can get really messy really fast. So what I'll often do with subjects is I'll always lower that opacity between 90 and 95%. And that's just a way to like soften up the contrast of your subject and help them blend into the environment a little bit more. Something else I always do is I will find, and we've already had some folks that are doing this like in a really awesome way, is I will find a paper texture. I usually use this paper texture, and I'll overlay it onto my object. So here's the rendering now, and we can kind of go ahead and here's that rendering now. And then that little paper texture just helps like blend in any of those really sharp edges that might kind of catch the eye and soften your image a little bit. It also helps kind of decrease like the differences between lighting. So adding that paper texture or any sort of texture over your entire rendering is a great way of just quickly like flattening your image a little bit. Also, you can also use that screening effect that I talked about. Let's see if I turn this all the way up. So this was like a, I think I did a grain, I used a grain filter in Photoshop, and I gave it a motion blur, so it was all going in one direction. And then by using the screen, it removes all that black. And now it looks like we have rain kind of going diagonally across our rendering. So that screening tool is a really awesome tool for things like that. And so again, I can kind of like start going through, and you can start to see the different layers, but my subject always has like a really low, just a slight shift in their opacity, which just helps things blend in a little bit. Yeah, so like, let's bring this little woodpecker up to 100. Like that looks good still, the lighting is just right, but it kind of pops out when you do like the squint test. And if we just decrease that opacity by 90%, it doesn't really bother me that I can kind of see a little bit of bark behind it. It just helps blend it into the overall image. And then finally, sometimes this is also a great way of finishing your image. Is bringing back that underlying source image and laying it over your rendering. And so that's another way I'll kind of like help catch like the tones and the lighting of a place. And so like if I remove this, like the things that I added are like really sharp and there's a lot of high contrast. But by overlaying that background image, it helps soften it up a little bit. And if we click on our entourage, you can kind of see again that I add that 75%. I changed the opacity to 75%, which decreases the contrast and kind of softens them up in the picture a little bit. So again, some just fast, nice ways of kind of like softening your rendering so nothing really pops out when you do that squint test is a paper texture is always nice to add on, or some other form of texture, and playing around with the opacity and multiply. Doing the same with like the background layer, exploring the layer adjustments and the color lookup, and seeing if there's any sort of filters that you can apply to the overall image that helps with the kind of color theme. And then let's see, finally, changing the opacity of their subjects in your rendering. Are there any questions?